So if I asked you to just close your eyes and picture the economy of South Asia, I mean, your brain probably defaults immediately to images of traditional farming,
For
right?
sure, yeah. Vast rural villages, maybe textile workers, basically an overwhelmingly agrarian society.
Exactly. That's the stereotype. But what if I told you that they're actually quietly building a $4 trillion digital empire?
And completely bypassing the traditional industrial revolution while they do it.
Right. Which is just wild to think about. So welcome to another custom-tailored deep dive. Today we are digging into a really fascinating source document.
Yeah, it's a completely paradigm-shattering piece of research.
It really is. It's this 15-page, highly data-driven academic blueprint. And what I love about it is how stripped down it is. I mean, the authors literally designed it to cut through all the cultural generalizations and, ignore all the political noise.
Right, it's strictly numbers. In fact, looking at the document itself, it's incredibly minimalist. It's all white backgrounds, these very subdued Morandi
Yeah,
colors.
like those low-saturation blues and grays.
Yep. Exactly. No flashy 3D graphics, just flat, hard data, specifically looking at the IDA and IBRD countries in South Asia.
And for anyone who isn't living in a World Bank data terminal, the IDA and IVRD classification basically just means we're looking at the developing and middle-income nations in that region.
Right. And the reason we're doing this deep dive, the reason you listening right now really need to care about this, is because of how interconnected everything is.
Yeah, I mean, if you manage global supply chains or if you're investing in emerging markets, or honestly, just trying to understand where the future of the global economy is actually headed.
If you miss this structural shift, you are basically trying to navigate the modern world using an obsolete map.
That is a great way to put it, an obsolete map. Because the entrenched narrative of this region has just been remarkably stubborn, hasn't it?
Oh, incredibly stubborn. We still apply this 20th century lens to a region that has fundamentally rewired its entire economic DNA.
Yeah. And slide one of this blueprint just immediately calls that out. It sets up this core question. Is this the traditional agricultural society we think it is? Or is it a rising digital service empire?
And then slide 2 hits you with the macro data, which is just a visual that is really hard to ignore.
The chart on that slide is crazy. It's this flat, Morandi blue area chart showing a parabolic curve of economic expansion.
Right. We are looking at a regional gross domestic product that has skyrocketed from approximately $164 billion up to nearly $4 trillion.
Which is, I mean, I have to stop and emphasize this for a second. That is not nominal dollars. The blueprint explicitly notes that this is measured in constant 2015 US dollars.
Exactly, which is a crucial distinction. It means this isn't just some mirage created by inflation over the decades.
Right, this is a 20-fold expansion of real, tangible economic size over the course of about half a century.
A 20-fold increase is just staggering.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit, because a 20-fold increase fundamentally shifts the gravitational pull of the whole global economy, right?
Oh, absolutely. You don't just add that much mass without changing the orbits of everything around you.
It's kind of like a startup that quietly scales into a massive tech behemoth, but everyone else still thinks they're, operating out of a garage.
That's exactly what it is.
But I do want to push back on this just slightly. Because, okay, a massive GDP number is great, but does a bigger pie actually mean the agrarian label is wrong? Or does it just mean they are doing 20 times more farming?
No, that's the thing. You can't reach a $4 trillion valuation by simply planting 20 times more crops or, spinning 20 times more textile looms.
The math just doesn't work.
Right. The math of subsistence and traditional agriculture simply cannot support that kind of parabolic wealth generation.
So the ingredients of the pie have actually changed.
Entirely. It suggests a complete transformation in their global role. They've moved from the periphery of the global market.
Where they were just seen as consumers of foreign aid, right?
Exactly. Consumers of aid and exporters of raw materials, and they've moved directly to the center as producers of high-value global services.
Okay, so if the ingredients changed, if the economy expanded 20 times over, what was the actual fuel for that growth? Because you don't just snap your fingers and get a structural economic miracle.
No, you don't. And to understand how a region engineers a 20x growth multiple, you have to look beneath those macro GDP figures at the underlying human capital.
Which brings us to slide 3 in the blueprint.
Right, the demographic dividend. Economists use that term a lot, but this data shows exactly what it looks like in practice.
Yeah, and historically, this region was operating under a massive structural weight. The chart here tracks the child dependency ratio. and it shows it's starting at a really heavy burden of over 72%.
Which is just a crushing burden for any developing economy.
I mean, if you think about it, for an economy to grow, it needs surplus capital, right?
Yeah.
You need extra money to invest.
Exactly. But when your dependency ratio is hovering above 72%, virtually every single dollar, every calorie of food, every hour of labor generated by your working age population.
It's all just immediately consumed by basic survival needs.
Right. Feeding, housing, and providing primary care for this massive, massive youth population.
So there's literally no surplus.
None.
Yeah.
And without a surplus, you can't invest in infrastructure, you can't build a robust domestic banking sector, and you certainly cannot seed a high-tech industry.
But the blueprint shows this massive turning point. That dependency ratio just plummets. It drops all the way down to around 50%, while the working age population, so that's people between 15 and 64, they steadily climb until they make up roughly 65% of the total population.
Right. The demographic pressure completely reversed.
Which is wild.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen similar demographic shifts in post-WWII Western economies, but the velocity here is what really stands out to me.
The speed is incredible. Suddenly you have this massive injection of productive capacity.
Right, but I'm looking at this and thinking, raw population alone doesn't build a digital empire.
Absolutely not.
Like having tens of millions of people in their prime working years is just a baseline. If those workers lack skills, that demographic bulge isn't an economic miracle.
No, it's a recipe for severe social unrest and mass unemployment.
Exactly, which is why slide 10 of this presentation is so crucial.
The literacy miracle.
Yes, the raw demographic shift was basically just the hardware upgrade for the region. But the literacy leap was the operating system upgrade.
That's a great analogy. The blueprint shows this historic leap in youth literacy, specifically looking at that 15 to 24 age bracket. The data points show this metric vaulting from under 50% to over 96%.
96%. And primary school net enrollment hitting around 97%.
Right. They essentially took half of their youth population, who historically would have been permanently locked into low-skill manual labor.
And they brought them online cognitively.
Exactly. They turned a dependent burden into this massive army of productive, trainable labor.
But, okay, let's play devil's advocate here for a second. Because the mechanics of that transition present a massive chicken or egg scenario.
How so?
Well, transforming a population from 50% to 96% literacy in a developing region, that requires an astronomical amount of capital investment.
Oh, it's incredibly expensive.
Right. You need schools, teachers, infrastructure, books.
Yeah.
So did the new wealth from the GDP growth fund all this education, or did the education spark the wealth?
Well, if you analyze the data patterns in the report, it actually suggests a compounding feedback loop rather than a straight line of cause and effect.
Okay, so how does that loop start?
It begins with early, relatively small baseline investments in basic health and primary schooling.
Like just getting kids into a classroom.
Right. And those initial investments unlock low-level economic gains. So maybe farmers can now read better agricultural manuals, which increases crop yield slightly. Or maybe factory workers can operate slightly more complex machinery.
Got it. So that generates a small, localized surplus of wealth.
Exactly. But the strategic divergence for South Asia, what made them different, was the decision to aggressively, almost relentlessly reinvest that initial surplus right back into human capital.
Oh, wow. So they didn't just spend it on immediate consumption.
No, it was poured back into the literacy engine, so that creates a slightly higher skilled workforce, which then attracts slightly higher value foreign direct investment.
Which in turn creates a larger surplus, and they reinvest it again.
Exactly. Over 50 years, that loop compounds into the 96% literacy rate we see today.
That is just phenomenal foresight.
Yeah.
Okay, so the region successfully engineers this massive, highly literate, working-age population. The natural next question is, where did they actually deploy this new workforce?
Right, because they aren't going back to the farms.
Exactly. And this brings us to slide 4, which marks the structural shift in their industries. And this really permanently dismantles that agrarian society myth.
The agricultural data here is so telling, but not because of its size.
Right, it's the volatility. The chart has these bright red numbers highlighting specific periods where agriculture value added didn't just stall out, it contracted violently.
We're talking negative growth rates, negative 10.13%, and even a drop of 11.43%.
I mean, a negative 11% contraction in a primary economic sector is just catastrophic.
It really is. It exposes the inherent vulnerability of building a national economy on a foundation that is dictated by the unpredictability of monsoon rains, or climate shifts and natural disasters.
Yeah, while farming is obviously a survival baseline for regional food security, its extreme volatility just makes it a highly unstable platform for a modern economy. You simply cannot maintain parabolic GDP growth when your foundational industry can shrink by double digits because of a bad drought.
You can't. And so, as agriculture demonstrated that extreme volatility, they had to pivot. And the services sector, shown on slide 5, is what absorbed that new literate workforce.
And it absolutely exploded. The steep upward sloping line chart here shows the service sector breaking right through the $1.9 trillion value-added mark.
But the real nuance, the thing that defines this entire deep dive, is what's happening inside that service sector.
Right. Slide 6 breaks down the commercial service exports. And this is the mind-blowing part. The share of communications and computer services surged from a marginal 3% to over 57%.
Over 57%. More than half of all the commercial services they export to the global market are now in the realm of computer data, IT, backend, and digital communications.
It's like they skipped the landline and went straight to the smartphone.
That's a perfect way to look at it. This represents a massive historical leapfrogging. They largely bypassed the traditional industrial sequence.
Yeah, because in Europe or North America, economies spent a century building steel mills, automotive supply chains, and all this heavy manufacturing just to generate the middle-class wealth necessary to eventually transition into a service economy.
But South Asia took this newly literate, 65% working age population and just plugged them directly into the global digital supply chain.
They traded the unpredictability of the monsoon for the hyper-predictability of server farms and fiber optic networks.
Exactly.
But, looking at this massive structural shift going from rural farming to a digital service hub exporting code and IT supports, the friction on the ground has to be just immense.
Oh, the societal friction is huge.
Because if digital tech is now eating up 57% of your service exports, but you still have a massive agricultural sector that can randomly contract by 11%, isn't there a risk of creating a severely two-tiered society?
What do you mean by two-tiered?
Well, you'd have this hyper-connected digital elite thriving in these massive urban tech hubs, right? And then on the other side, you have millions of forgotten rural farmers who are still left dealing with those negative crop yields.
The employment data on slide 8 actually fully supports that concern.
Yeah, the area chart showing the cross-industry labor migration.
Right. We see a steady, undeniable decline in the share of both men and women working in agriculture. Meanwhile, industry and services have absorbed hundreds of millions of transitioning workers.
Hundreds of millions. The scale of that migration is just hard to wrap your head around.
It is. But as you pointed out, the modernization is highly asymmetrical. Millions are migrating into the modern sectors, yes, but millions more are trapped in an analog past.
So managing that political and economic divide between a population living in a 21st century digital economy and a population still subject to the whims of subsistence farming, that has to be one of their most profound ongoing challenges.
Without a doubt, it sets up a very complex societal divide.
Okay, so we've built this massive digital empire in our minds, but we also have to ground this in physical reality.
Right, the hardware of the software boom.
Yeah, because we use terms like cloud computing and digital exports, which
Right.
makes it all sound sort of weightless, right? Like it just exists in the ether.
But a digital service empire still requires massive physical integration with the global economy.
Exactly. You can't run enterprise software exports on a 56K modem in a vacuum. You need servers, you need cables, you need infrastructure.
And we see that spillover effect beautifully illustrated on slide 7, the high-tech manufacturing exports.
Right. It shows them climbing from under 0.9% to over 1% of total exports.
And I know 1% might sound small in isolation, but you have to remember the scale we are talking about.
A $4 trillion economy.
Exactly. 1% of a multi-trillion-dollar export market represents a massive volume of highly complex, technology-intensive physical goods.
So their industrial base actually had to evolve from purely labor-intensive manufacturing, like, basic garments, to producing the physical infrastructure necessary for a tech hub.
Right. They had to rewire their physical connection to global trade networks.
And the most striking metric of that physical integration is on slide 9, the aviation logistics.
The air freight volume chart.
It is a staggering vertical bar chart. It shows a tenfold explosion in air freight volume, jumping from roughly 9.5 million ton kilometers all the way up to a peak of over 1,000 million ton kilometers.
A greater than 10x explosion.
Yeah. But this raises a really fascinating question for me about causality in developing these tech hubs.
Okay, what's the question?
Well, does a massive expansion in physical logistics, like, say, a government building a bunch of world-class international airports, does that attract the tech sector? Or does the success of the digital exports force the government to build the airports just to keep up?
That is a great question. It operates as a highly symbiotic relationship, but generally speaking, the initial demand is typically driven by the digital sector's success.
So the software demands the hardware.
Exactly. As the IT and computer service exports surged to that 57% mark, it generated this immediate corporate demand for rapid global connection.
Right, because tech executives require global mobility.
And high-value, specialized hardware components, the kind needed to build server farms, those require overnight, secure shipping, not slow ocean freight.
Oh, that makes total sense. You aren't putting microchips on a container ship for 6 weeks.
No, you're flying them in. So the economic success of the digital sector provides both the capital and the tax base to justify building these massive air logistics hubs.
And then once those hubs are active,
Yeah.
I assume it dramatically lowers the barrier to entry for more high-tech manufacturing to set up shop locally.
Precisely, which then drives the air freight volume even further up that tenfold curve.
Wow. Okay, so we have essentially mapped out the architecture of a $4 trillion economic miracle. They optimized their demographics, they achieved near-universal youth literacy, they leapfrogged into a digital service economy, and they built the physical logistics to support it all.
It's an incredible success story.
It is. But this is where the source data pivots sharply.
Right. We have to address the invoice for all this growth.
Exactly. The blueprint dedicates a significant portion of its analysis to detailing the severe, almost existential constraints that are threatening to derail everything we just discussed.
The pain points.
Yeah. And the most immediate of these, highlighted on slide 11, is the environmental toll.
The data here paints a very grim picture of an exponential, largely unchecked rise in greenhouse gases.
Specifically carbon dioxide and methane, right?
Yeah.
Driven by buildings, agriculture, and energy production.
Yes. The region has achieved massive economic growth, but the data clearly shows they have utterly failed to decouple that growth from carbon emissions.
It's basically the equivalent of trying to run a sleek, 21st century digital software empire on a dirty 19th century industrial era power grid.
That's exactly what is happening. The code they are exporting might be clean, but the plug powering the servers goes straight into a coal furnace.
And the localized impact of that is terrifying. Slide 12 looks at the public health crisis, specifically tracking PM 2.5 air pollution exposure.
The numbers here are they're hard to look at.
Yeah. The exposure level consistently hovers around a highly dangerous 60 micrograms per cubic meter. But the truly chilling statistic on this dashboard graphic is the exposure rate.
Almost 100%.
Almost 100% of the population is exposed to air quality that exceeds World Health Organization safety guidelines.
An exposure rate of nearly 100% indicates a massive systemic failure. It means the pollution is not localized to just a few heavy industrial zones.
Right, you can't just move to the suburbs to escape it.
No, it is inescapable. And, the misconception we often have in the West is that transitioning to a digital or service economy inherently cleans up the environment compared to heavy manufacturing.
Right, because we just assume typing on a keyboard doesn't produce smog.
Exactly. But the physical reality of the cloud is incredibly heavy.
How so?
Well, think about the energy demands required to run thousands of hyperscale data centers for a global market. They are astronomical.
And baseload power in this region is still heavily reliant on fossil fuels.
Right. Furthermore, absorbing that 65% working age population required a wave of unprecedented breakneck urbanization.
Oh, because everyone is moving from the farms to the cities.
Exactly, and pouring millions of tons of concrete and manufacturing the steel required to build brand new megacities to house all these tech workers. That is one of the most carbon-intensive processes on Earth.
Wow. This creates a really devastating paradox regarding their human capital.
The literacy paradox?
Yeah, we spent the first half of this deep dive marveling at the literacy miracle. The 96% of youth who are now cognitively equipped to drive the economy.
Right.
But PM 2.5 pollution isn't just an environmental issue. It's a severe neurotoxin.
It is a massive public health crisis.
Exactly. Long-term exposure at 60 micrograms per cubic meter causes chronic respiratory failure, it lowers cognitive function, and it aggressively reduces overall life expectancy.
They are essentially systematically poisoning the very demographic dividend that their entire economic model relies upon.
It's tragic.
In economics, we call this a massive negative externality. If your workforce is chronically ill, their productivity drops, your healthcare burdens spike, and the structural advantage of having a young population is completely neutralized by the environment they're forced to breathe every day.
You can't code if you can't breathe. But the environmental debt is only one constraint. Slide 13 transitions into the macroeconomic vulnerabilities that are acting as shackles on their continued growth.
The debt and inflation data.
Yeah, it's a dual-axis chart. The primary axis shows central government debt stubbornly fluctuating between 50% and 60% of GDP.
Which is high.
Right. And then the secondary axis tracks CPI inflation. And we see these severe spikes of volatility, including periods of double-digit hyperinflation breaking well past 10%.
Attempting to sustain foreign investment and domestic growth while trying to balance 60% government debt and fighting double-digit inflation is incredibly precarious.
That's like dancing with handcuffs on.
It really is, because when inflation breaches 10%, it instantly vaporizes the real purchasing power of the newly formed middle class.
The people who just escaped agricultural poverty.
Exactly. It creates immense domestic instability, which in turn elevates the risk premium for the foreign capital that is absolutely essential for funding their digital infrastructure.
So the macro foundation is shaky. But honestly, looking at the data, slide 14 reveals a structural failure that is arguably more damaging than the debt or the inflation.
The missing engine.
Yes, the massive gender gap in the labor market. The dumbbell chart here directly compares male and female labor participation, and the visual gap is huge.
It is staggering.
The data shows male labor force participation running exceptionally high, somewhere between 75% and 83%.
Very healthy numbers.
Right. Yet female participation in formal wage employment remains staggeringly, persistently low.
It is, without a doubt, the single most glaring inefficiency in the entire 15-page data set. It represents a colossal misallocation of human capital.
I really want to spend some time on the mechanics of this because to me it defines the logic of the data we established earlier.
How so?
Well, the region achieved 96% youth literacy, right?
Right.
That means millions of young women are highly educated, fully capable, and ready to participate in this digital service economy. The state and their families have already paid the massive upfront capital cost of educating them.
They've made the investment.
Exactly. So why would an economy go through the immense effort of building a highly tuned twin-engine jet and then deliberately turn off one of the engines right before takeoff?
Well, education is only the first hurdle. The blueprint's data points toward deeply entrenched structural and societal barriers that education alone simply cannot dismantle.
Okay, unpack that for me. What kind of barriers?
When we look at the physical reality of joining the formal workforce in a rapidly urbanizing developing nation, the friction for women is immense.
Like literally getting to work?
Yes.
Yeah.
You're talking about infrastructure that was built almost exclusively around a male breadwinner model.
Oh, wow.
If public transportation networks are unsafe or unreliable for women to navigate independently, their radius of potential employment shrinks drastically.
That makes total sense. If you can't commute safely, you can't take the job.
Exactly. And then consider the urbanization itself. If this rapid, breakneck urbanization failed to include affordable, standardized childcare systems, what happens?
The burden of unpaid care work defaults entirely to the female population.
Right, regardless of their literacy level. You can have a master's degree in computer science, but if there's no one to watch your child, you are out of the formal workforce.
Wow.
Furthermore, formal workplaces in these expanding megacities have largely not adapted to the realities of a dual-income family structure, the brutal hours, the lack of flexibility, and the prevailing societal expectation that a woman will simply exit the workforce upon marriage or childbirth. It all creates an invisible but incredibly rigid wall.
It is just a staggering economic deadweight loss. I mean, you have a $4 trillion economy fighting 60% debt, and the ultimate untapped productivity reserve is sitting right there, already educated.
Which brings the entire blueprint to its climax in Section 7, Slide 15, the crossroads.
Risk of the middle income trap.
Exactly. The authors synthesize the momentum and the constraints to forecast the region's trajectory.
So let's weigh the scales based on the data. On the momentum side, we have the twin engines, right? The parabolic explosion in digital and computer service exports, fueled by this massive, highly literate demographic dividend.
Right.
But on the constraint side, we have an economy choking on its own PM 2.5 pollution, weighed down by 60% macro debt, and operating at essentially half capacity because it has structurally folded its female workforce.
And the conclusion drawn from this synthesis is that the region is at a highly, highly dangerous pivot point.
Because the easy growth is over.
Exactly. The 20-fold growth proves their model works for escaping low-income status. However, the broad-stroke growth that comes from simply mobilizing a massive young population into basic services, that phase is largely over.
So what does it take to get to the next level?
Moving from middle income to high income status requires a fundamentally different level of economic efficiency and sustainability. If they cannot mitigate the environmental externalities and successfully integrate the female population into the formal workforce, their digital empire faces a severe risk of a hard landing.
Getting stuck in the trap.
Right. The middle income trap occurs when an economy loses its competitive edge in cheap labor because their workers are getting richer, but they haven't achieved the institutional and structural efficiency to compete with fully developed high-income nations. Growth simply stagnates.
Okay, looking at these existential threats, the smog, the macro debt, the missing female workforce, how do the mechanics of solving them actually interact? Because if I'm looking purely at the constraints provided in the data, unleashing the female labor force seems to be the prime domino that just has to fall first.
The data strongly supports that sequencing.
Because you need money to fix the environment, right?
Massive amounts of capital. Transitioning a nation of over 1 billion people to a green energy grid to eliminate that PM 2.5 pollution, that will cost trillions of dollars.
And you can't exactly borrow it when your debt is already at 60%.
Exactly. Paying down a central debt burden that equals 60% of GDP requires a massive expansion of the tax base. You simply cannot generate that scale of new, inclusive wealth while intentionally leaving half of your highly educated population outside the formal economy.
So the women are the key to the green transition.
Integrating women into the workforce provides the immediate structural surge in GDP and productivity required to simultaneously manage the macro debt and fund the unbelievably expensive green transition. It is the missing capital engine required to power the rest of the solutions.
It's a profound realization.
It really is. The math is undeniable.
So as we wrap this up, why does the data in this 15-page blueprint matter so deeply to you, the listener? Why should you care about the female labor force participation rate or the PM 2.5 levels in South Asia?
Because the isolationist view of global economics is completely dead.
Exactly. This region's crossroads is our crossroads. Whether you are using enterprise cloud software at your job, or relying on global supply chain logistics for the manufactured goods you buy, or just interacting with the back-end data management of your daily digital life on your smartphone, you're plugged directly into South Asia's digital service empire.
We all are.
Their ability to navigate this transition to stabilize their debt, clean their air, and empower their female workforce will directly dictate global inflation rates. It will dictate the stability of the digital services you rely on, and it will set the pace of global technological innovation for the next decade.
If they hit the middle income trap and suffer a hard landing, the shockwaves will be felt in your portfolio and in the operational costs of nearly every modern company.
They have moved from the periphery to the absolute core. They are a foundational pillar upon which the 21st century global economy is currently balancing.
And that balance is very fragile right now.
It is. Which leaves us with one final, deeply provocative thought to explore. This builds directly on the revelations of this data, but it looks just one step further into the future.
Okay, what is it?
Well, we've established that this region achieved a 20-fold economic explosion, right?
Oh.
And it was largely built on the backs of millions of newly literate youths performing digital, IT, and computer services for the rest of the globe.
They became the human infrastructure of the digital world.
Exactly, human infrastructure.
Mhm.
But as artificial intelligence begins to aggressively scale and automate the exact entry-level coding, the routine tech support, and the basic data processing jobs that fuel this region's rise.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. What happens to a digital service empire when those services no longer require human minds to execute them?
That is a terrifying question.
Will their greatest historical advantage, this massive young tech-adjacent workforce, suddenly transform from a demographic dividend into a demographic time bomb? If the foundation of their $4 trillion miracle was built on human code, what happens to the region and the world when the machines learn to write it themselves? Something for you to think about until next time.